The mud of the 9 mouths had me to the hip and would not give me back, and the woman hauling on my collar was losing, and she did not stop. "Lean," she said, "not up, nobody ever leans the right way." I leaned the wrong way. The mud took another inch of me, patient as a debt. "There," she said, as though I had done something clever. She let go of my collar, walked around behind me through water that came over her knees, put the flat of an old wooden basket under my thigh, and stood on it. Then she took a fistful of the back of my shirt and pulled, and the delta let me go with a sound like a kiss from something that had never loved anybody. I came out sideways into 3 inches of water, and lay there with my face turned to the sky, breathing. I had been a king for 11 years. I had opened the long reach to the shallow draft boats when 3 councils said it could not be done. I had put down the salt riots without hanging a man, which nobody remembers, because nothing is so quickly forgotten as a rope that was not used. Once, in a bad winter, I carried a bull calf 2 miles through a drift because a farmer wept about it, and the story went around the marches for a year, and I let it, because a king should be seen carrying something. And I lay in the shallows of a river mouth with mud in my ears and in my collar, and in the hinge of my jaw, while a stranger tipped my boot out and shook it. "It's the second bank," she said, not looking at me. "Everyone thinks it's the ridge. The ridge is fine. The second bank has been eating people since my grandmother. You can walk it at low water if you go crabwise." Crabwise. Sideways, small steps. You put your weight down slow and you keep the other foot loose. She held out the boot, upside down, and a black rope of mud slid out of it. "Wash that in the channel, not the pool. The pool's got the town in it." She was perhaps 30. Her sleeves were rolled past the elbow and her forearms were the color of the mud to the elbow, and she had a short curved knife on a cord at her hip, the kind a woman uses to take muscles off a stone. Her hair was tied back with a strip of sailcloth gone gray. She had a face you would not think to describe to anyone, and then you would discover 3 days later that you could still see it exactly. "Thank you," I said. She said, and picked up the basket and went back to the stones. I want to be honest about what I was, because everything that follows is bent by it. 3 weeks earlier, my boat had been holed in the long reach by 3 of my own oarsmen. It was done well. That is the part I still turn over. They did not do it in the dark or in the rapids. They did it in flat water at the top of the reach, a mile from the bank, with the auger through the garboard on the blind side, and they did it while I was asleep under a tarpaulin with my sword belt hanging on the mast like a man who has never been hated. They had been paid in northern silver, 30 pieces, ship-marked, the kind that comes down from the seaports and not up from the marches. And they had been paid, I think, more than they had ever seen and less than the thing was worth, and they had not thought it through, because they were oarsmen and not murderers. They had not thought about the fact that, when the water takes a boat, it does not ask which men hold it. 2 of them went down with her. I heard Perrin shouting his brother's name and then not shouting it. The third, Ilb, got to the eastern bank and lived 9 days, and then went off a wall in a river town in the dark, which is a thing that happens with great reliability to men who have been paid too much for one night's work. I swam. Nobody swims the long reach, and everybody knows it, and so I have very little to boast of. It is only that I was on the wrong side of an argument with the water for 6 hours, and the water grew bored. I came out 4 miles down among the willow stumps with a leg that had been bent the wrong way by a thwart, and I lay in the wet clay and listened to the horns going up along the bank behind me, searching. And I understood, lying there, that whoever had counted out that silver would hear those horns too, and would learn that no body had been found, and would spend the next week making certain there was one. A king who swims is a joke, and a joke is a kind of shield, so I let the joke go up the river and I went down it. I went down it as a lame man with a stick and a name I had taken off a dead cousin. Sten. It is a name that sits well in a mouth full of fish, a name for a man who has rowed for other men and has nothing to show for it but hands. My leg was not entirely a lie. I made it more of one. I put 20 years and a bad winter into my back, and I let my beard come in gray where it wanted to, which it did, eagerly, having waited some time to be asked. And because I was hunted, I counted. I want that understood because everything turns on it. From the harbor stair to the fish market, 140 paces, 2 blind corners, one door that opened outward and would therefore hold 3 seconds against a shoulder. From the market to the tide mill, 311 paces, a plank walk on stilts that could be cut in 2 places with an axe in 1 minute. I counted the boats in the roads every morning and I knew which had come in the night. I counted the men in a room before I heard a word any of them said, and I found the exit, and I sat where I could see it. And I did this so constantly and so completely that it stopped being a thing I did and became a thing I was. 11 years of kingship had not taught me to count. 3 weeks of being nobody taught me in an afternoon. Lomouth was a town built the way a bird builds, out of whatever the water had left lying about. Plank walkways up on stilts over black mud, oyster stairs going down to nothing twice a day and to shoulder-deep water twice a day, roofs of tarred shingle, patched with the transoms of dead boats, so that if you stood on the tide mill and looked across the town, you could read the names of 40 drowned smacks on the rooftops of the living, gulls that had opinions and shared them. The whole place smelled of salt, tar, hot shell, and the inside of a fish, and at low water it steamed. The harbor stair was the town's spine, 41 steps of stone from the plank street to the flat, and the second step from the bottom was worn into a shallow scoop that filled with weed twice a day. And if you put your weight on it wrong, the weed took your boot and the mud took the boot after that. "Mind the second step," she said to me on my first morning down it. "It eats boots." She was under the stair, in the dark wet triangle where the timbers met the mud, filling her basket. I had not seen her. I had counted the stair, the men on it, the fishwives at the top, the 2 lads sitting on the coping with their legs hanging, and I had not seen her, and I had come within a foot of her. Nobody saw her. That was the first thing I learned about Elspeth Kell, and it took me a shamefully long time to understand that it was not an accident of the light. They stepped around her the way you step around a puddle, not cruelly, and that is the thing that still turns my stomach when I go back to it. There was no cruelty in it anywhere. A man came down the stair with a basket of whiting on his shoulder and passed within a hand's breadth of her and did not slow, did not nod, did not look, and it cost him nothing, and it had cost him nothing yesterday, and it would cost him nothing tomorrow, and by now it would have cost him a great deal to do otherwise. At the top of the stair the fishwives sold to everyone. When Elspeth put her coin on the board, they took the coin and put her muscles in her own cloth and said nothing, and turned to the next customer, and the next customer said good morning to them, and they said good morning back, and that was all. It was so smooth. It had been polished by use. Watching it done was like watching a good joint in a hull, where you cannot find the seam with a fingernail. 9 years I learned, 9 years of nothing. I learned why in a beer house with a floor of packed shell that crunched when the drinkers shifted, from a man who told it the way you tell a thing that has stopped being a story and become a fact of the ground. His name was Ori, and he mended nets, and he had lost 2 fingers doing it. He told it with his forearms on the table and his eyes on the middle distance, and when he had finished, he did not look at me for a reaction, because there was nothing in it to react to. It was simply how the delta had come to be shaped. The surge, 9 years back. A wall of water up the Vess in the black of an autumn night, and no moon, and the church bell going and going. The ferry master then was a man called Tam Kell. And the ferry master of the 9 Mouths held the mooring lines of the whole town. Every boat in the delta was made fast to the great chain at the ferry house, because that was the law and the sense of it, and had been since anyone's grandfather. And when the surge came up the mouths, Tam Kell went out onto the ferry house steps with an axe, alone, with the water already round his knees, and cut the chain, and let 106 boats go out into the dark. Because the chain held the boats, and the boats, 106 hulls, made fast in a raft 200 paces long, would hold the water and turn it, and the water so turned would take the ferry house and the harbor stair and the tide mill and both plank streets, and, he judged, standing on those steps with his hands shaking, the low quarter where the mending women lived with their families. He was right. The water came in and it had nothing to shove, and it went over the flats and out again. 40 families lost their boats. 6 lost everything they had, which in the 9 mouths is a boat. Nobody drowned. And that's the whole of it, said Ori. Nobody drowned. Nobody ever drowned. So how do you weigh it? 40 boats against a drowning that never happened. He turned his cup. My cousin lost the marrow. She was 40 years in his family. He never got another. He mends the ferry now for a wage, and he's civil about it, and he'll drink to Tam Kell's memory if you ask him, and he'll not say a word against the girl. Not a word, I said. Not one, said Ori comfortably, and drank. Tam Kell died 2 winters after the surge, of a chest cough that took 11 weeks about it, and the Delta buried him, because you bury a man. On the day of the burial, the Alpha of the 9 mouths, hauled, said some words about the difficulty of judgment and the loneliness of a man who must decide in the dark, and they were good words, and there were 900 people on the shell grit, and a fair number of them wept. And then, quite gently, without any vote or any ceremony or any written thing at all, the pack agreed to stop seeing his daughter. Now the plank. The salt crossing is the Delta's oldest custom, and it is not in itself a wicked one. Twice a year, at the lowest tides, the Vess pulls back off the great flat between Lomouth and the chapel bank, and the pack crosses on foot to the old chapel and comes back at dusk, and there is a feast on the shell grit with tar barrels burning. It is a mile of mud. The harbor office lays a plank walk across it the day before, good elm, 6 spans wide on trestles, an honest piece of work, and the pack of the 9 mouths crosses dryshod, 4 abreast, singing, in whatever they own that is best. And those who are not of the pack wade. Not as a punishment. Nobody in the 9 mouths would use so hot a word, and if you used it to them they would look at you with real bewilderment. It is simply that the plank is for the pack, and she is not of the pack, and there it is. 9 years. I knew none of this on the morning of the crossing. I knew only that I could not walk a mile of mud on that leg, that my leg was a lie I had told so well I was now trapped inside it, and that the king of the marches could not be discovered in the middle of a mud flat being hauled out by 4 fishermen, and asked, kindly, who exactly he might be. So I stood at the head of the plank in a crowd of 500 people in their best coats, smelling of camphor and new tar, and I understood that in about 90 seconds I was going to be seen. And I did what a hunted man does. I counted 206 people already on the walk, 3 trestles visible from where I stood and the near one settling, 9 paces to the mud on the left, 7 on the right, hauled at the head of it all in blue and silver, big-shouldered, laughing, a man built to be looked at, a man who had that morning stopped in front of a boy with a barrow and asked after the boy's mother by name and by ailment. His daughter Maris at his elbow in a gown the color of a new leaf, holding her skirts up out of the shell grit with 2 fingers, looking pleased and slightly bored, 22 years old and entirely untold. The crowd opened, the way water opens, without anyone doing anything. She came down through it in a brown dress with her sleeves rolled and her muscle knife on its cord, and she stepped off the end of the good elm into the mud, and she began to walk. And I heard Maris Hald say, kindly, in an ordinary voice, to nobody in particular, in the tone of a woman remarking on the weather to a friend she has known all her life, Elspeth, do go carefully in the middle, it's soft where the channel was. And 200 people did not laugh, because there was nothing to laugh at, and the pack drew breath to sing. I do not know exactly what I intended. I have gone back over that moment more times than I have gone back over the long reach, and I cannot find a decision anywhere in it. My leg was a lie. My name was a lie. Every hour of the last 3 weeks had been spent in the service of a plan, and the plan was worth a kingdom, and it required above all things that Sten the lame oarsman be a man nobody looked at twice. I went off the plank. The mud came over my boots and I went down on the bad leg like a hinge, hard, and somebody swore, and somebody else said, "Let him be. He's the cripple that came in on the timber boat. He'll want a hand at dusk." And 40 paces out on the flat, Elspeth Kell stopped and turned around. She looked at me for a while. It was not a warm look. It was the look of a woman assessing a load. Then she came back. She walked out of her mile and back to the plank's end and stood over me and said, "You can't." "I can't," I agreed. "On my back, then. Or sit here and they'll fetch you at dusk and you'll have missed it, and they'll talk about the fetching for a month." I said something about my weight. She said something about a boat's worth of wet mussels and how I should try carrying them up 41 steps twice a day. Then she crouched in the mud with her back to me and said over her shoulder, "Arms, don't grip my throat. Everyone grips the throat." And so the alpha king of the marches went across the salt flat on the back of a mussel picker, in front of the whole pack of the 9 mouths, who did not look at either of us. She was strong the way people are strong who have never once in their lives thought about being strong. She went crab-wise, small steps, feeling for the hard sand under the slick with the ball of her foot before she gave it anything. And she talked the whole way, not to comfort me, I think, but because a mile is a mile, and she was not in the habit of company. Left of that post, there was a channel there when I was small, and the mud remembers it. Everything remembers. You're heavier than a boat's worth. What did they feed you upriver? See the birds standing, there and there. That's hard ground. Birds won't stand where it's soft. They'll sink to the knee and they hate it. Every soul in this town has walked past 100,000 birds and not one of them has ever asked the birds anything. Out on the flat the singing came to us thin and pleasant over the water. The plank walk went past us on our left, 6 spans up, full of blue and green and silver, and a small boy on it stared down at us for a long moment, the way children do, before his mother turned his head with the flat of her hand as gently as you would turn a plant toward a window. Halfway across, I realized that I had not counted anything since she crouched down in the mud. I want to be exact about this, because it is the only thing in this story I have never been able to explain, and I have stopped trying. I had counted every hour of my life for 3 weeks. Before that, I had counted in a different currency, guards and doors and the arithmetic of a hall, who sat near whom, whose son had married whose cousin, what a silence at a table was worth. And further back than that, before the crown, in a cold room with the horn going in the yard, I had counted the years I had been alone and made my peace with the number, and the peace was a good one, and it had held. And on the back of a woman whose name I did not yet know, in the middle of a mile of mud, with her breath going hard and even under my chest, and the smell of salt and sweat and crushed shell in my face, I went silent inside for a quarter of an hour, like a bell that nobody is striking. My wolf, which had not truly slept since the long reach, lay down somewhere behind my ribs and did not stir. "Post," she said, "hold on." She put me down on the chapel bank where the shell grass starts, and stood with her hands on her knees, blown, getting her wind. Then she scraped the worst of the mud off her forearms with the back of her knife, in long strokes, the way a man cleans a spade, and washed her face and neck at a rain butt, and shook out her skirt, and went into the chapel with everybody else, and stood at the back, where there was room. There was always room at the back. I sat down on the grass and looked at my hands, and understood, with the particular sinking clarity of a man who has just discovered that his own careful plan is going to be paid for by somebody else, that I was not going to leave the 9 mouths in a week. I stayed a month. I will tell you what a man learns about a kingdom from the bottom of it, since I did not know, and I was its king. I learned that the harbor office weighed the mussel baskets on a beam that was true and the oyster baskets on a beam that was not. I did not learn this from a rebel or a rumor. I learned it from Elspeth, on a Tuesday, standing in the queue behind her while a clerk called when her made a mark in a book. "Watch the P," she said, without moving her mouth much. "The what?" "The little brass P on the oyster beam. It's on the wrong side of the pivot by about the width of your thumb. Been like that since they mended it the spring before last. Marn dropped the beam and it was mended by a man from up the coast who did not know his business, and nobody said anything, because who says anything to a beam?" I watched. A woman set down a basket of oysters that would have gone 11 pounds anywhere in the marches, and the beam said 10, and Wenner wrote 10, and the woman took her coin and went, and neither of them had done a single dishonest thing. "How much?" I said. "A penny and 9, said Elspeth, and set her own basket on the true beam which said what it saw. A penny and 9. It sounds like nothing. It is the difference between a woman's roof and a woman's roof after the rain. It is 1 basket in 9 that a man rows for and does not eat. Multiply it by 900 souls and 11 years, and you have a sum that no one has stolen, that no one is guilty of, that sits in the harbor office's takings like silt in a channel, and a good, hearty, generous alpha who remembers your mother's name walks over that channel twice a day on a plank walk he built himself, and never once looks down. I learned the tolls, 3 on every boat that came through the third mouth, which was the deep one, and none on the other 8, which were shallow, which meant nothing at all to the great trading hulls that must use the deep water and could pay a bishop's ransom, and everything to a man with a smack who must use the deep water because he has a family and cannot afford to lose a tide. Every toll in the delta was arranged so, once you looked, with such consistency that it could not be accident and such small mercies attached to it. A widow's remission here, a bad year forgiveness there, all of them announced, all of them warm that it could not quite be called theft. And I learned about the 3 drowned oarsmen, because Elspeth told me, without knowing what she was telling me. By then we had arrived at something. It had happened the way such things happen among people who have no words to spare, on the 4th step of the harbor stair which is above the tide line, where she sat in the late afternoon with her basket between her knees, cracking mussels with the point of her knife and eating them. The first week she said nothing to me. The second week she put 4 mussels on the step beside me, without comment, and did not look to see whether I ate them. That was the whole of it. Twice a day for a month, I sat 2 steps below the only person in the 9 mouths who spoke to me as though I were a man, rather than a piece of the town's weather. "Casfaro's rent's paid," she said. "Whose?" "Cass, 3rd house on the plank street, the one with the good door." She cracked a shell. "Her man went upriver last autumn to row for the king. They wanted Delta men for the Reach, and he never came back. They said the boat went down, and she had nothing, and she stood in that doorway all winter looking at the frame of it, and now her rent's paid, and it's been paid since the spring." "Somebody's charity," I said. My mouth had gone dry as shell. "Somebody's charity out of the harbor office," said Elspeth Kell. 3/4 paid across the desk in silver, and Wenner wrote it in the book as tide relief, and there hasn't been a tide relief paid in this town since my father was a boy and the mill burned." She cracked another. "The silver was Northern. It has a ship on it. I saw it come out of the purse." I sat very still. "From under the stair," I said. "From under the stair. There's a knot hole in the office wall where the timber's dried out, and the wall's the same wall, and the mud under it is where the best mussels are because of the warm water from the mill. Men stand at a desk and think the room is the world. Do you tell people what you hear?" She looked at me then, with the little curved knife loose in her fingers and her mud-colored forearms on her knees, and her eyes were not friendly, exactly. They were level. "Who," she said, "would I tell?" There it was, 9 years in 3 words without a scrap of self-pity in them. "I went to see Cass Farrow. I have thought since that it was the most cowardly hour of my life, and I would not give it back. I went as Sten, with a stick, and I stood in her doorway on the plank street and said I had rowed with her husband, which was true. God help me. Perrin Farrow had pulled the number 3 oar on my own boat for 2 years and had a laugh like a gate, and she looked at me for a moment and then stood back to let me in, because that is what the Delta does. The house had a good door and almost nothing behind it. A bed, a stool, a box, a shelf with a cup on it that was too fine for the shelf. "They sent his coat back," she said. "Not him." "No. There's men come back to this town off worse boats than that one." She was not weeping. She had done that. She was 35 and her hands were quiet in her lap and she was looking at the door frame. I don't say it to anyone because it's an ugly thing to say, but I'd rather he'd been a fool than what he was. I said nothing. The blood had gone out of my face and she took it for pity. "He came back in the spring before it, you see," she said. "For a fortnight. He had money he wouldn't say the shape of. He mended that door." She nodded at it. "He'd never mended anything. He was full of a great plan and he wouldn't tell me and he laughed at me for asking. And I let it be because he was happy and I hadn't seen him happy for 2 years." "And the rent," I said. "Paid across the desk of the harbor office. 9 months of it now." Her chin came up a very little. "I take it. I want that known. I take it and I'll go on taking it because I have nothing, and because I have thought about it every night since the spring, and I cannot make the arithmetic come out any way but one. If he did what I think he did, then somebody paid him for it and somebody has a conscience about me. And if I stop taking their money, the only person punished in this whole Delta will be me." She looked up. "You've gone white," she said. "Sit down. Nobody sits in this house." I sat down in the house of the widow of the man who holed my boat, and she gave me water in the cup that was too fine for her shelf, and I drank it. Outside on the plank street, a gull was screaming and screaming about something, and I put it together the way you put together a hull. 3 oarsmen, Delta men, wanted for the Reach because Delta men know shallow water. Paid in northern silver, ship marked, 30 pieces. 2 drowned in the water they made, the third off a wall. A widow in Lomouth whose rent is paid across a desk in the same coin, by a clerk who writes it in a ledger under a heading nobody has used in 40 years. Because the man who ordered it is a hearty, generous man who remembers names, who could not bear to think of himself as the sort of man who leaves a widow with nothing, and who therefore left, in his own account book, in his own clerk's hand, the only confession he was ever going to make. He had done it as he weighed his oysters. He had not lain awake, a penny in 9. And it was not even greed, quite. It was arithmetic. In 11 days the King of the Marches was expected in the Delta. Everyone knew it. It was the reason for the new paint on the harbor office, and the reason a gown the color of a new leaf had come down from the city in a box, to sit at the salt crossing feast, and to take the toll of the third mouth into the crown's hand, which he had announced, and to look at the daughters of the Delta houses, which he had specifically declined to do. A dead king delays a toll by a year, and a year is a long time, and after a year there is always another reason. And a live king who arrives to find his kingdom loyal and his hall full of flowers and a girl in green at the foot of the table, that is another kind of insurance. Hald of the 9 Mouths had bought both, at a fair price, from 3 local men, and had then, being a decent fellow, seen to the widow. I went out of Cass Farrow's house, and stood on the plank street with my hand on the rail. That night I sent 1 line upriver on the timber boat, to Anselm, who had been my first oar for 20 years, and who had spent 3 weeks believing he had let me drown. Alive bring nothing comes slow. And then I did the thing I have been ashamed of ever since. I stayed on for 8 more days as Sten, and let her carry me. Not on her back, not again. But she took me out at low water and taught me the second bank and the birds, and where the channel had been when she was small. She showed me the knothole and let me put my eye to it and see the desk from underneath, and told me which board creaked. She told me who owed what to whom in a town of 900 souls, and did it without malice, as a chart maker named Shoals. And every evening she sat 2 steps up the harbor stair with her basket between her knees, and gave me half of what she had. And none of it, not 1 hour of it, did she give to the king of the marches, because he was not there. He was standing behind a lame man's face taking notes. I let her think I was nobody because it was useful, and because it was the only condition under which anybody in that town had ever been kind to me. Both of those were true. I have never decided which was the reason. She told me about her father once and briefly on the 8th evening, when the tide was making and the light on the flats was the color of the inside of a shell. He wasn't brave, she said. People say brave. He was frightened all the way through it. I was 11. I was on the step behind him. I saw him. His hands were going like this. She held up a hand and shook it hard and put it back on her knee. He cut the chain because he could count. That's all it was. He knew what 106 boats made fast in a raft would do to the surge, and he knew what the surge would do to the low quarter, and he did the sum, standing in the water with his hands shaking, and then he cut. And they never forgave the sum. They forgave him, that's the joke of it. She said it without laughing. They cried at his burial. 6 of them carried him, and 4 of those 6 had lost boats, and Hald said the words, and they were good words. It's me they never forgave, and here's the thing, Sten, I don't think anybody chose it. The first year it was too raw and nobody knew what to say. The second year it would have been strange to speak to me after a whole year of not speaking. The third year it was just how things were done. And now it's 9 years and it isn't a thing anyone is doing. It's how the town is shaped, like the second step. She turned a muscle over in her fingers. I'm not sad, she said. I want that said. I get so tired of people deciding I'm sad. What are you then? She thought about it with real care, the way she thought about the mud, and took her time, and answered honestly, which was the only way she knew how to do anything. Awake, she said. The next day, Maris Hald came down the harbor stair. She came in a plain gray dress with a girl behind her carrying a basket, because it was her father's custom that his household should buy at the stair like everyone else, and it was a good custom, and she performed it 3 times a year. She was pretty in an unfinished way. She had never in her life been told a difficult thing. I was mending a line on the 4th step, being a lame oarsman, and I saw the whole of it. Maris went to the fishwives and bought, and turned to go, and then stopped, and looked down at the wet triangle under the stair where Elspeth was working, and I watched a struggle go across that girl's face that I would not have believed if I had heard it described. She wanted to speak. She did not know how to begin. She had never been given a single word for it, not one. There is no phrase in the language for I have not spoken to you since I was 13, and I no longer know why. And there were 9 or 10 people on the stair, and every one of them would have heard. She said, "Good morning." 2 people on the stair turned their heads. Elspeth looked up from under the timbers with her hands full of shells. There was no triumph in her face and no warmth either. She looked at Maris Hald for 2 seconds, and Maris's chin came up, and her mouth opened. And a fishwife at the top said cheerfully, "Bless you, Miss Maris, that's the tide coming. You'll want the plank street," and put a hand on her elbow kindly, as a friend does, and turned her, and she went. Elspeth put another mussel in the basket. "She's not a bad one," she said to the timbers when the stair had emptied. "That's the trouble with it. There isn't a bad one anywhere in this town. You could go door to door." They came for me on the 9th night, at the top of the harbor stair. It was my own fault entirely. I had spent 2 hours in Ori's beer house asking about the tolls of the third mouth, and I had asked one question too many, and the question was, who wrote the tolls? Because a man who mends nets does not know, and a man who does not know is a safe man to ask, and a man who does not know may nonetheless mention in the wrong company that the crippled oarsman off the timber boat is very interested in the harbor office. I came out at the second bell. There was no moon. The plank street had 2 lamps and one was out. I counted them before I saw them, which is to say I counted a silence. 2 men at the head of the stair, standing where men do not stand, not talking, at an hour when men who are not working talk. I could have gone back into the beer house. I want to put that down. There was a door 9 paces behind me that opened outward, and I had noted it 3 weeks earlier, and I did not use it, because I was tired, and because a part of me that had been kingly for 11 years and was still not cured wanted to know their faces. The tall one said, "You're the oarsman." "I'm an oarsman." "You're asking about the office." "I'm asking about a berth," I said. "There's men that can't row and I'm one, and a man has to eat." And it might have served. I have gone over it, and I think it might have served if the short one had been alone. But the tall one had already decided, hours ago, in a room I never saw, and he had decided because he had been told to decide, and he did not want to do it, and men who do not want to do a thing do it too fast. On a good leg, with my hands and my wolf, they would have been an inconvenience and a bruise. But I had spent 3 weeks teaching my body to be lame, and a body is a great believer. The knee gave under me before it was struck. And I was old and slow with fish and beer and a month of being nobody, and the short one got behind me at the coping. I hit the tall one once, and it was a good blow, and I heard something go in his face. Then the stair. 41 steps. I went down perhaps 11 of them, and I remember thinking, with a kind of exhausted amusement, as the scoop of the second step came up out of the dark and the weed took what was left of my footing. She told me. Then the mud, then the ebb. The ebb of the 9 mouths goes out under you and pulls like a hand, steadily, without any malice, and the mud has a particular smell close up when it has you, a hot, dead, sweet smell of the bottom of the world. I could not find the ground with a leg that would not answer. I got a hand on a stair timber and the weed slid me off it. Above me on the stair, 2 men stood and watched a cripple be taken by the tide, which is the easiest killing there is because it is not won, and can be spoken of afterwards truthfully as a thing that happened. I went under, and the water was thick, and I thought about Perrin Pharaoh shouting his brother's name. Then a basket came down on a rope. It was a poor rope. It was a muscle picker's rope, a fathom and a half of frayed hemp with a basket on it, and it hit the water beside my head, and it would not have held a dog. And behind it came Elspeth Kell off the bottom step, feet first into the black, with the knife in her teeth like a woman going down to cut a net free. She got a fistful of my collar, of course she did. "Lean," she said, spitting water furious, "not up." I do not know how she found the hard ground. She found it by knowing where it was. That is the whole answer, and it is not a small one. She had been in that water twice a day for 9 years, and there was not a spade's width of it she had not stood on. She dragged me on the diagonal, out of the pool, sideways, small steps, 100 paces along to the fish stairs where the shell shelves out, and we came up the beach on hands and knees. Above and behind us, on the harbor stair, the 2 men had gone. They had watched for a while, I think, and had seen a woman go into the water and had not been able to make out much, and had not much wanted to. She sat down in the shallows and shook. That was the only time I ever saw her do it. Her teeth were going and her hands were going, and she swore at me steadily and quietly for perhaps half a minute. A good vocabulary, learned young on a working stair, and then she stopped and put her forehead hard against my shoulder. Once, the way you press a bruise to find out whether it is real, and took it away again. "Who are you?" she said. It was not a question, it was an accusation. I said nothing. "Nobody sends 2 men to the head of a stair for an oarsman." Her voice was steadying with every word, and that was worse. "Nobody comes to Lomouth from upriver in autumn. Nobody asks who wrote the tolls. Nobody listens to me for a month." She lifted her head. "I have been a fool. I have been a fool in the one way I promised myself I never would be, which is to be glad of a person. 10 seconds. I have had longer reckonings with myself, but not fuller ones." I could have told her. I have argued this out for 30 years, and I still cannot see the shape of the man I would have been if I had. Perhaps a better one. What I saw, sitting in the shallows with the mud drying on my hands, was this: that if I told Elspeth Kell that night, Then in the morning she would have to walk down her stair carrying the king of the marches inside her mouth, alone, in a town that did not see her, with 2 men in it who had already been paid, and that she would have carried it and would have died before she dropped it, and that I had already put quite enough on her back. Tomorrow, I said, at the crossing, I'll tell you and I'll tell every soul in this delta in the same breath, and you'll hear it standing up in the daylight and not from me in the dark where you have to decide whether to believe me. I owe it to you sooner. I'm asking you for tomorrow. She stood up. She looked down at me, sopping, mud to the shoulder, 41 years old, a king in a fishing town in the dark, with a lie coming off him in the water like oil, and I watched her understand that whatever I was not less than she had thought. And I watched her understand that being not less was going to cost her something, and that she had already paid the first of it, which was the going into the water. Then don't sleep on the plank street, she said. Sleep under the stair. Nobody looks there. I slept under the stair. The tide of that salt crossing was the lowest in 11 years. The flat lay out to the chapel bank in the dawn like something beaten flat with a hammer, and then polished, shining, going pink and then white, and the birds stood on it in their thousands where the ground was hard, and I lay under the harbor stair on a heap of sacking with the town waking on the boards above my head, and watched the harbor men go out with the trestles. They laid the plank at first light, 6 spans of good elm. It took 9 men and 2 hours, and they sang while they did it, and it was a fine piece of work, honestly made, honestly paid for out of the tolls of the third mouth. By mid-morning the whole pack of the 9 mouths was on the shell grid at the head of it, in blue and green and rust red, smelling of camphor, waiting for a king who was coming down from the marches to sit at their feast. Anselm was in the third mouth with 2 boats and 40 men, and orders to come no closer than the bar. He had sent me back 1 line by the timber boat, which I have still, in a box, with 3 other things. 9 years an oar, 11 a king, and you send me word by a timber boat. Get on with it. I stood in the crowd in a dead man's shirt, with a stick I did not need. Hald went up onto the plank's head to speak, because a plank is a stage, and because he was the sort of man who could not see 6 spans of elm above a crowd and not stand on it. And he spoke well. I want that on the record, because it would be easy to make him small, and he was not small. A small man could not have done what he did to me, and a small man could not have made 900 people love him for 11 years while he took a penny in 9. He spoke about the surge. He spoke about the boats that went out into the dark and the men who had lost them, and he named 4 of them, and he named the Marrow, and Ori's cousin put his hat in his hands. He spoke about the difficulty of judgment, about how a delta carries its dead and its debts together, out and back, twice a day, and how there is no man alive who can say that he would have been wiser standing on those steps with an axe. He said that mercy is a tide and not a decision. It was warm. It was generous. It was true. About half that crowd had wet eyes, and Mara stood below the plank in a gown the color of a new leaf and looked up at her father with her whole heart in her face. And I looked at her and thought, she does not know. She has never once in her life been told anything. Then the crowd opened, the way water opens, without anyone doing anything. Elspeth came down through it with her sleeves rolled and the knife on its cord, and she did not look at me, and she stepped off the end of the plank into the mud and began to walk. The pack drew breath to sing. Wait, I said. I did not shout it. This is the piece that nobody has ever believed, and I do not much care. There were 900 witnesses, and about 6 of them noticed at the time. 100 people were talking. I said it in the voice you use to stop a horse, and the singing did not begin. I went up onto the plank. My leg was fine. That is what turned them, I think, before any word of mine, that the lame man went up the trestle in one movement and stood at the head of the walk, and the whole delta watched a cripple stand on 2 good legs. Hald's face went through several countries in about 2 seconds and came to rest, and it was the resting that told me everything. He was not astonished. He was doing arithmetic. The king of the marches isn't coming down the river today, I said. He came down it 4 weeks ago with a hole in his boat. 900 people made a sound like a wave going back over shingle. I told it fast. I have never been a speaker, my father was, and it did him no good in the end. 3 oarsmen out of this delta, hired for the reach because delta men know shallow water. An auger through the garboard on the blind side, in flat water at the top of the long reach. 30 pieces of northern silver, ship-marked. Perrin Pharaoh and his brother drowned in the water they made. Ilb off a wall in a river town. And a widow on the plank street with 9 months of rent paid across the harbor desk, in that same silver, and written in the ledger as tide relief in the clerk Wenner's hand. And I asked Wenner, who was standing at the near trestle with a pen behind his ear and his mouth open, whether he would like to fetch the book himself, or whether we should send a boy. Wenner sat down in the mud. Hall did not run and did not lie. It is the one thing I will say for him, and I have said it to myself many times, on the nights when I could not sleep for the memory of the sound Perrin made. He stood on his own plank, above his own town, with his daughter below him, and he looked at me for a long moment, and he said, "You were in my town for a month." "I was under your stare," I said. "They told me you swam." He said it almost wonderingly, turning it over, a man checking a column of figures that will not come out. "In the reach. Nobody swims the reach." I let that stand in front of 900 people until it had finished being an answer. Then I said what had to be said, and I said it quickly, because a judgment that is enjoyed is a judgment spoiled. The tolls of the third mouth are the crowns from today. They will be paid to Cass Pharaoh, and to the widows of the other 2 men, until those 3 women say stop. And after they say stop, the tolls will buy this town a beam that weighs true, and pay a man from the city to come every year and check it, and the man will be changed every 3 years, and the changing of him will be written in the book. Wenner will read the ledger aloud tonight in the fish market, all of it, from the surge onward, and he will read it again tomorrow night for the men who are at sea. Every soul in the 9 mouths who has been short-weighted a penny in 9 on a basket of oysters will hear the number, and the number will be paid. Hald of the 9 mouths sits at no board and holds no office. He will go to the oar bench of the Lomouth ferry and pull it, and be paid a fair wage for pulling it for as long as the crown says. He keeps his house. He keeps his name. And his daughter keeps everything that is hers, which is a great deal, and she has done nothing. And she was told nothing. And if I hear one word said against Maris Hald in this delta, I will come back down this river and tell you all exactly what I think of a town that likes to choose one woman to carry what the whole of it did. And Maris, standing in the mud below the plank in her green gown with her hands at her sides, was not looking at her father and was not looking at me. She was looking out at the flat, at Elspeth Kell, who had stopped 40 paces out in the shining mud and stood there with her arms at her sides, listening. So I said the rest of it to her, because there was nobody else left in the world to say it to. 9 years ago the ferry master of this town did a sum in the dark, I said, and cut a chain with his hands shaking, and the reason every one of you is standing on this mud today instead of lying under it is that his sum was right. He is dead. You buried him and you wept and 6 of you carried him. And then you sent the bill to his daughter, and you have been quietly collecting it every day for 9 years, and not one of you has ever once said aloud that you were doing it. Because a thing that is never said aloud never has to be defended, and never has to be voted on, and never has to end. Last month I came into this town on a bad leg to find the man who bought my death. 900 of you looked straight at me and saw nothing worth seeing, and because of it I found what I came for. I found it under the harbor stair. She fed me out of her own basket. She taught me the ground and the beam and the birds. She pulled me out of your mud with a wooden basket under my thigh. And last night she went into the black water off the 2nd step after a man she had every reason on this earth to leave in it. And a fortnight ago she walked out onto this flat, alone a mile in front of all of you because your plank is for the pack. And she turned round and came back for me and put me on her back and carried me across it, and I let her. I let her, knowing what I was. I stood at the head of this walk this morning knowing that before I said one word about kings, I would have to admit that in front of her. And then I stepped off the plank into the mud. That is all it was. It was not planned and it was not a fine gesture. I went in over my boots and the delta took me at once to the shin, the way it takes everyone, and I stood in it in front of my own kingdom with 6 spans of good elm at my shoulder and my hands empty. Nobody in this delta crosses dry today, I said. 900 people looked at the mud. I have been in 3 battles and a hard council and a coronation, and I have never known a silence with so much weight in it. It went on. It went on long enough that I began to understand that I might have to stand in the mud alone for a mile in front of my own subjects, and that if I did, I would deserve it. Then a very old fishwife at the back, I never learned her name, and I have wanted to for 30 years, and there is nobody left who can tell me, said, quite loudly, in the tone of a woman conceding an argument about the price of whiting. Oh well. And she sat down on the shell grit and took off her shoes and tied the laces together and hung them around her neck and stood up and stepped down into the mud. And it went through that crowd like fire through reed. They came off the plank. I watched them come. Ori the net mender came off backwards carefully on his bad hip and lost a shoe within 4 paces and hooted about it. Ori's cousin, who had lost the marrow, came off with his hat still in his hands and stood in the mud and looked at his own feet for a while. The fishwives came off together, 4 of them, holding each other's forearms and shrieking with laughter like girls. A man in a good coat did not come off, and stood on the elm alone for a moment, and then came off in the good coat. Wenner came off with the ledger held over his head with both hands, like a man fording a river with a hymn. A boy of about 8 came off in a great flying leap on purpose and went into the thigh, and his mother went in after him and did not scold him. Maris Hald came off in the new leaf gown, and it was ruined in 1 step entirely, past any mending. She went on without stopping, holding her skirts in both fists, her face set straight ahead and burning, and she did not look at anyone and nobody looked at her. And for the first time in her life she was walking through a crowd that had agreed not to see her, and I have often wondered how much of what she became afterward was decided in those 40 paces. And Hald stood alone on 6 spans of good elm above his town, for perhaps a minute. Then he came off too. Nobody helped him and nobody hindered him. He crossed the mile with the rest of them at the back, and that was the entire punishment I ever gave him, and I have come to think sufficient. They crossed, 900 of them, the whole pack of the 9 mouths, wadding, with their shoes round their necks and their best coats hitched, crabwise, small steps, the ones who knew where the bird stood calling it back to the ones who did not. And when I got out to where Elspeth was standing, she did not fall into my arms and she did not weep, and she certainly did not kneel because she was Elspeth Kell. She let the crowd go past us. She stood still while 900 people walked around her in the mud, which they had never done before in her life, and every single one of them looked at her, which they had also never done. She bore it the way she bore weather. She waited until they were 50 paces on. Then she said, "You watched me wade." "Yes." "A fortnight ago, from the plank." Her voice was perfectly steady, and that was the worst of it. There was no anger in it that I could take hold of. "And I came back for you and I put you on my back, and you rode a mile of that flat, and you knew, the whole way, every step, that you could have stopped it with 1 sentence. I knew. You were counting something more important." "Yes," I said, "and it stopped." She looked at me for a while, with the mud drying pale on her forearms. "That's a pretty thing to say to a woman," she said. "Say it to a woman with a house." And she turned and walked on toward the chapel bank, and did not look back, and I let her go. I have thought about that hour more than any hour of my reign, and I know now that letting her go was the only wholly good thing I did in the 9 mouths, because there was not one argument I could have made to her on that flat, not one, that would not have been the same argument in a different coat. I am the king. I saw you. I have made you visible. Be glad. Every word of it would have been the loudest thing on that mud, and she had spent 9 years being the quietest. So I gave her the only thing I had that she had not already been given too much of by that town, which was silence. Anselm came up the mouths that evening with 2 boats and 40 men and a face like a closed door, and looked at what I was wearing, and said nothing for a full minute, and then said, "Sire," in a voice that could have stripped paint. The Delta cooked its feast and ate it on the shell grit in the dark with its shoes hung around its necks. Wenner read the ledger aloud in the fish market by lamplight until he was hoarse, and read it again the next night, and the numbers went round the town like a tide. And when he came to the entry that said tide relief, there was no sound at all in that market except the gulls. I went upriver in the morning. I did not send her anything. That was the hardest administration of my life, and it lasted a year. No letter, no coin, no house, no place at any board, no summons, no gift, nothing with my name on it, nothing that could be set down in front of her on a table by a man in livery so that she would have to answer it in front of him. Twice Anselm asked me what I was about. The second time he said a thing I have not forgiven him for and will one day, and it was this: "She is a muscle picker, sire, and you are making a poem out of her." And I said something back to him that took the color out of his face, and we did not speak for 11 days, and then we did, and we never mentioned it again, and he was at the wedding. What went down the river that year was this: the tolls of the 3rd mouth, into 3 widows' hands monthly in coin, with the crown's mark on the receipt so that no clerk could ever call it charity. Cass Farrow took hers and bought a boat, and hired a man to row it, and then learned to row it herself, and she is alive as I write this and has never once written to me, and I would not have her do it. A beam that weighs true, and a man from the city to check it every spring, and his name written in the book, and the man changed every 3 years. 2 clerks who read a 9-year ledger aloud in a fish market until they were hoarse, and then read it again the next night for the men who had been at sea, and then, because a Delta thinks about a thing slowly and all at once, a 3rd night, unasked, because the town had begun to send its own boys with questions. And a ferry pulled by a big-shouldered man in his shirt who was paid a fair wage for it, and who, I am told, became in time an unremarkable and civil person, greeted on the water, not much spoken of. That is the whole of what I wanted from him. I have been asked by better men than me why I did not hang him. I have never had a good answer. The nearest I have is that I stood on his plank in his coat once, and understood exactly how a man arrives at a penny in 9, and that a rope would have let the Delta believe the thing had come from outside. She was offered things that year, and refused most of them. The harbor office offered her the weighing of the mussels, and she took it, because she liked it, and because she said the P on the oyster beam had made her want to see a beam kept honest for once in her life. And in November, Maris Hald came down to the harbor stair in a good coat and sat down on the 4th step, in the wet. She sat there for a long while and said nothing. Then she said, "I don't know how to begin." And Elspeth, from under the timbers with her hands full of shells, said, "Then don't begin, just sit." And they sat. I know this because Maris wrote it to me, 4 years later, in a letter that was mostly about the mending of the chapel roof, and put it in a line at the bottom as though it were nothing, which is how the Delta tells you the only thing that matters. In the spring I came back down the Vess. I came on a timber boat, alone, on 2 good legs, with no crown and no escort and 1 clean shirt, because the salt crossing was 3 days off and the tide was low, and because I had thought about it every day for a year and could not find any way of asking her that was not the loudest argument in the world. Except one. I walked down to the harbor stair at low water. The plank walk was going out onto the flat, half-built, the trestles going down in their line, the men singing. She was under the stair, in the wet triangle filling her basket. "You'll be crossing then," she said without turning round. "Wadding," I said, "if it's allowed." "It's a public mud." She cracked a muscle with the point of the knife and looked at it and threw it away. "You look better." I stopped counting. She said, which was, I had learned, the sound she made when a thing was true and she was not going to help you with it. Then she came out from under the stair with the basket on her hip and stood in front of me in the ordinary daylight of the Nine Mouths, mud to the elbow, 31 years old, and looked at me for a while. "I'm not going to be a story," she said. "The one they carried across the flat, the muscle girl the king saw." She said it flatly, without heat, the way she had said the second bank has been eating people since my grandmother. "I'd rather wait another 9 years. I know it. And I don't want a haul. I saw a haul once. My father took me up the river when I was 9, and there was a man in the yard playing a horn at nothing." "There is a horn," I admitted. "I have never known what to do about the horn." Something happened at the corner of her mouth, which she did not permit to become anything. "Then what are you asking me for?" she said. "Exactly." And I found that I had no speech. I had made one on a plank a year before. It was the truest thing I had ever said in public, and it had bought me precisely nothing. And standing on the shell grit at the foot of 41 steps, I discovered that I did not want to ask her for anything at all. I did not want to give her a kingdom or a name or a place at a board. I wanted to be somewhere she was, for as long as she would allow it, and I wanted her to go on telling me about the birds. "Come out on the flat with me," I said. "That's the whole of it, not the crossing. Tomorrow at the ebb before anyone's awake, show me the birds again. I have thought about the birds for a year, Elspeth, and there is nobody in the marches to tell about them." She stood there. Then she put the basket down on the second step. She put it there deliberately, with both hands, on the scooped stone where the weed was, the step that eats boots, and she took her hands off it and left it, and it was the most extravagant thing I have ever seen a human being do. "Small steps," she said, "sideways you never did learn." We were married in the autumn, in the chapel on the bank, at low water, and the whole delta waded to it and complained about it happily for 30 years. She would not be carried, and I never once asked. She took the horn away from the horn player gently in her first month, and gave it back to him after a conversation, and he never again played it at nothing. She would not sit at the head of a board. She would not have the word Luna said at her more than once a season, and the marches loved her for it in a way they never loved me, and she said that was because I had 11 years head start on being disliked. She was not a saint, and I will not make her one here. She could carry a grudge across a mile of mud without setting it down. She never spoke to Hald again in her life, not once, though she was perfectly civil about his existence, and when he died she went to the burial and stood at the back where there was room, and came home and said nothing about it and cleaned her knife. The plank of the Nine Mouths was laid for 3 more crossings. Each of those 3 years, the king came down the river and went off the head of it into the mud with his shoes hung round his neck. Each year, fewer people bothered with the elm. In the 4th year, the harbor office simply did not build it, and there was a small argument about the cost of the trestles and whether the timber might be better used on the chapel roof, and that was the end of a custom that had stood 400 years. Nobody made a speech, nobody voted, nobody carried anybody. 900 people walk a mile of mud together, twice a year, crabwise, small steps, feeling for the hard ground under the slick, and the ones who know where the birds stand call it back to the ones who do not. I am an old man now, and I have a great deal to be judged for, and the Delta has judged most of it out loud in a fish market, which is the only court I have ever trusted. But there was 1 hour in the middle of a mile of mud, when I was the most hunted man in the marches, and I was carried across it by a woman that 900 people had agreed not to see. I lay along her back with my chin by her ear while she talked about channels and birds and where the water used to run when she was small, and the whole vast machinery in me that adds and adds and adds the doors, the exits, the men in the room, the years alone, simply stopped and lay down and was quiet. It has never started again. That is what I would tell them if there were anyone left to tell. Not the plank, not the tolls, not the ledger, not the king standing in the mud. Only that I counted every step of my life until the day I stopped, and that I have never since, not once, wanted to know the number.